Welcome to GoodChristadelphianTalks. I'm Levi.
I'm Chris.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Brian. Thank you for joining us this week.
On this podcast, we select one talk a week to help us get the Bible in our daily news feed.
Each week, we post a talk that we previewed from suggestions sent in by listeners from around the world.
Then, we record a short intro beforehand as a personalized recommendation to you on why we are sharing the talk.
And now, let's talk more about this week's talk.
Hey everyone, this is Jason Hensley. This week we are going to be listening to a talk by Brother John Bilello. I believe it was given at the LA Ecclesia, and I'm not totally sure the date. However, when you listen to the talk, you'll notice that there's a few things that he says that makes it sound like we're looking at probably the late 90s. Now you might be wondering, why are we listening to a talk about science from the late 90s? You know, that's almost 30 years ago. So surely the science is outdated. And I would agree with the sentiment that there are some things that are outdated here. So when you listen to this, you have to listen with a discerning mind. But at the same time, I think a number of the things that Brother John brings out are still really helpful to consider. He talks about his colleagues at the University of Michigan and how a number of his colleagues believe in God. And he makes a really helpful distinction, I think, between the direction that science goes in the belief in God and the direction that liberal arts tend to go in the belief in God. And I found that in my own work, that it really does tend to be the liberal arts focus that seeks to remove God and inspiration from texts like the Bible. So I think there's helpful foundational kind of stuff that he goes through in this talk. Some of the immediate things that he talks about, like he'll reference, an article that just came out or something like that. Well, we can recognize that the article is old, but I think really a lot of his foundational points and a lot of the main ideas that he brings out are really helpful to consider. So, this is Brother John Bilello with his talk entitled Darwin or God, given likely at the Los Angeles Ecclesia, probably sometime in the late 1990s. Enjoy.
Some of you attended last year when we did the Bible and Science seminar in Simi Hills. I talked about the Bible and physics. I'm not going to talk about that at all tonight. I'm going to concentrate tonight's talk on evolution and on Darwin, and on some of the issues arising thereof. And it's been becoming progressively aware that in many ways, the way evolution gets taught in high school is usually about 20 years behind what scientists are doing who are working in the field. There's also a common sort of mythology that scientists do not believe in God. I don't think that's true either. At the university, many of the people I work with in the physics department and in the material science department not only believe in God, but are quite faithful. And several people are very Orthodox Jews, for example, every day do their daily readings, every day do their prayers, and are very dedicated to God's Word. And they do not accept Darwin as an answer to creation. And it is not unusual at all to get into debates, but most often with the philosophers. Scientists themselves have a great deal of reason, and particularly in physics. Over the recent years, there have been so many different discoveries in the universe and in relation to the structure of matter that people have been really wondering about it. I picked this passage, and I'm going to read you several more passages, because I want you to realize that God has written to us in two ways. The first is through the Word of God in the Scriptures, which He has confirmed through His prophets and His holy men. And God has confirmed that Word through Jesus Christ. The second way is through nature itself. God is the author of nature. And when we read this in Psalm 19, verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament or the earth showeth his handiwork, I think we ought to take that quite at face value. that the evidence of God is everywhere around us in nature, in the marvelous design in which God has created life and the universe itself and the laws which govern it. And these are not accidents. And so that it's perfectly legitimate to look into these things and to presume that we understand that these things are not just accident. They're not just there by some fantastic roll of the dice. They're there because God has designed it. In fact, in a recent book, one Jewish physicist said, I like this phrase, he said that God is the author of physics. The laws of physics, in a sense, God was the first physicist. And the laws which govern creation were done that way. I wanted to show you something interesting. A couple of weeks ago, when I was up in the Bay Area, I picked up the San Francisco Chronicle, which is obviously not a paper I would usually read. And this paper had published this report based on a scientific survey, and I'll read it to you. Scientists have been accused of playing God when they clone sheep and of naysaying God when they insist that evolution be taught in school. But a new study indicates that many scientists believe in God by the most mainstream, uppercase definition of that concept. Repeating verbatim a famous survey first conducted in 1916, Edward Larson of the University of Georgia has found that the depth of religious faith among scientists has not budged, regardless of whatever scientific and technical advances this century has wrought. Then as now, that's 80 years ago, about 40% of responding biologists, physicists, and mathematicians said they believed in a God who, by the survey's strict definition, actively communicates with humankind and to whom one may pray in expectation of receiving an answer. Luba, a devout atheist, had predicted that this belief in God would grow as education spread, and Larson decided to use the psychologist's exact methods to see if that prediction held. He polled the same number of researchers as had Luba and used the same source for picking his subjects, the Directory American Men and Women of Science, a compendium of researchers successful enough to win awards and be cited regularly in scientific literature. He followed Luba's survey format to the letter, with the same introduction and the same questions written in the same stilted language, even enclosing the same type of envelope. More than 600 of about 1,000 scientists answered the questionnaire, and it was similar to Luba's response rate 80 years ago. And this is a very strict definition. I believe if you asked scientists a simpler question, just did they believe in God as the creator of the universe, probably 85 or 90% would say yes. This strict definition of a God who answers prayer and everything is, I think, much more complicated. But nevertheless, this person, Luba, a psychologist, 80 years ago, took a survey, and he expected that within 25 to 40 years, no one would believe in God. And it turns out the very people who he hoped to use as proof still have this great faith. And this book, American Men and Women of Science, you can go look it up in the library for yourself. And if you look up Bilello, I think I'm in there. It may be a relative, I'm not sure. Take a look, and it's kind of interesting. So this idea that scientists don't believe in God, I don't think is true. And I think it's too often cited. In fact, in another survey about 10 years ago at Yale University among students, it was found that the physics students believed in God by more than 3 to 1, and the divinity students were split about half-half, which I think is kind of interesting and shows you what may be somewhat wrong with the way religion is being presented to people. That if the people who are responsible in the community at wide for that word do not have deep faith, then how can you have the congregations to be faithful? I want you to look at a few other quotes that I think are relevant. Psalm 14:1. If you would follow me, and it will all be up on the screen, so if you don't have to really go looking back, but you might want to note a few of these verses. The fool said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, they have done abominable works, there is none that doeth good. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. And that that's important, that if we understand and we believe in God, then we have to seek Him out. There's a responsibility on us to do something about it. And a lot of people, that's why they don't want to believe, because if they believe, they have to do something about it. And I think it is interesting that he said that those who say there is no God are fools. And by and large, most scientists are not fools. They try very hard to seek truth. They have all the same foibles and mistakes and evils and immoralities everybody else in the community. But with respect to seeking evidence, they're pretty careful about it. And if the evidence were zero, I can assure you most of my colleagues would not profess to believe in God. I have gotten, over my lifetime, very little flack from colleagues in physics in terms of my beliefs, but I usually get it from the liberal arts people and the philosophers who say, how can a scientist believe? And I think it's because they don't firsthand seek out their own information. We read this quote already, which is well worth remembering, because it is the evidence of nature besides the Word that should lead people to God. When we see around us the marvelous things of God's creation, we should be impelled to do something about it. Another interesting quote is this one in Numbers, because God has created this universe and this planet and us for a purpose. He hasn't created it in vain. He didn't create it just by pure accident, but there is a purpose behind this creation. And that purpose, he says, is, as truly as I live, and if you take the whole context of Numbers, it's God who's speaking. He says, as truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord. So I think it doesn't take much imagination to realize that equally must hold for the universe. God has not created the universe in vain. He's created it for a purpose, and in the ultimate purpose is to fill it with His glory. And so we have a choice to partake in that. Another very interesting verse is in Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 31. And I think that's worth looking at also. I put it in the NIV, and I'm going to read it. That's the New English version. The New International Version. I'm going to read it in the King James or Authorized Version also. So if you turn with me to Jeremiah chapter 31. Now here the prophet Jeremiah was speaking in the last days of the Commonwealth of Israel, when the Babylonians were at the doorstep, literally, and were going to carry the nation into captivity. And he makes these comments about God and His relationship with Israel. And in verse 35, he says, "Thus saith the Lord, which giveth the sun for the light by day, and the ordinances of the moon and of the stars for a light by night, which divideth the sea when the waves thereof roar. The Lord of hosts is His name. If those ordinances depart from before me, saith the Lord, then the seed of Israel shall cease from being a nation before me forever. Thus saith the Lord, if the heaven above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all they have done, saith the Lord." And so God uses the laws of the universe. He appoints the sun to sign by the, who decrees. And another word for this, it uses the word ordinances in the NIV, and other versions have used the word laws, who has set the laws of the moon and the stars. And basically what God's saying is, I have set the laws of gravitation, and I have set the laws of physics, and those laws are very firm. I wrote them. And if those laws could change, then I will change my promises. So far from not using science, God cites science as a proof of the steadfastness of His own word. And I think that's quite remarkable, and I don't think it ought to be ignored. And gravity is a very fixed law. And I want to make this point because when we talk about evolution, we're not talking about a law. We are talking about a theory. And no one ever talks about the theory of gravity. That would be ridiculous. I mean, if I throw this thing up, it's going to come down. And it's going to come down here and everywhere on this planet. It's only 25 cents, so I won't worry about it. But that's a law. Now, when it comes to evolution, that's a theory. And 150 years later, we're still calling it a theory. And yet when Newton wrote the laws of gravity, they already knew from Galileo's experiments that they worked. And they work everywhere. And what's remarkable is he says, if you look out, he says, they shine by night. If you look out into the stars, the same laws of physics are obeyed that astronomers see no matter how far they look into the universe. The same laws of physics seem to be obeyed everywhere where telescopes have been shown. And that's quite remarkable. Whereas a theory is something that people still are not sure of. And any critical experiments to prove the theory of evolution have never, ever been done. I'll talk more about that in a little while. So I think we have to make that differentiation. And when we're talking about science, there's two kinds of science. There's science that's provable by theory, experiment, and confirmation. And then there's science which is in its formative stages where there's a theory evolved, but definitive proof is lacking. And the very fact that scientists still call the theory of evolution a theory is the clue that definitive proof has never been made. So I want to get that point across, and I want you all to sort of remember that, because it gets thrown at you, and it often gets thrown at you at the junior levels. And my own children went through high school, and I know my oldest boy got in a tremendous argument with his biology teacher. And of course, she said, and Andy is a tough one to argue with. He's the most, verbal type person. And finally, she called me up, and she says, I'm having a lot of trouble with your son. I just can't get through to him about evolution. I said, well, what was he telling you? And she told me, and I said, oh, yeah, well, that's pretty good. I agree with him. She says, what? So she said, I don't understand this. You're a scientist. How can you believe that? That's the old cliche. I says, you're a teacher. How can you teach what you're teaching? I says, just because the state standard curriculum, when I went to high school, I happened to have a good Orthodox Jew as a teacher. And the way he taught biology was, here's the theory of evolution. Please learn it for the state exams. It's mostly baloney. Now, I don't think a teacher can get away with that today. They probably lose their job. But be aware that the very fact that something is called a theory means it has not been proven. And I don't know anyone who would have the audacity to say the law of Darwin. So that's an important point to remember. But God says the laws of physics are so firm that he would base his promises on it. This is in the King James, which we just read. He repeats it again in chapter 33, verse 7. And you see the difference. What God is not drawing upon theories here. He's talking about the laws of the universe, the laws that govern the physical universe. And here in chapter 33, again, I'm reading this in the Authorized Version, 33 and 7, Jeremiah, just a page or two over. I will cause the captivity of Judah and the captivity of Israel to return, and will build them as the first. So God is talking about the days when he would bring the Jews back to his land. And he says that is going to happen. And then he goes down, verse 19, and this is really critical because we know the Jews have come back to the land. We've seen that, that's happened twice. It's happened in 1948, and they have been replanted as a nation. And he says here, verse 19, Jeremiah 33, and the word of the Lord came unto Jeremiah, saying, thus saith the Lord, if ye can break my covenant or law of the day and my covenant of the night, that there should not be day and night in their season, then may also my covenant be broken with David my servant, that he should not have a son to reign upon his throne, and with the Levites, the priests, my ministers. He's talking about Jesus Christ, because that's the seed of David that he's talking about. And he's saying, I will bring a Messiah. And it's so firm, it's as firm as the laws, the covenants that I've made to control day and night. The revolution of the planets, the motion of the moon around Earth, the revolution of the Earth around the sun, and the motion of the planets. He says, though that's how firm it is. And then he says, as the host of heaven cannot be numbered, neither the sand of the sea measured, so will I multiply the seed of David my servant and the Levites that minister unto me. Now that's quite a remarkable verse, verse 22, because in the year when that was written, Jeremiah wrote about 5.5 centuries before Christ. You could look up at the night sky and you could count the number of stars. There were about 2,000 of them. And the Babylonians and the Chinese astronomers cataloged them. Now, if you look up in the night sky with your naked eye, maybe in Los Angeles you can't see anything but smog. I'm not really sure. But in my backyard in Michigan, there's no smog. If it's not raining, I can actually see the night sky. And if you see it, you can see they're very clearly marked. What is remarkable is that as men have built telescopes, the further and further they look in space, the number of stars, the number of galaxies just multiply and multiply and multiply. And in fact, there are so many of them, there probably are more than the sand in the seashore. If anyone's ever heard Carl Sagan, he'd go billions and billions and billions. That's just because the number is so large you can't write it down. If I were to write down the number of stars that are visible so far with known telescopes, and I put a 1 down, and I start putting zeros, we would be here for several weeks, and I would not finish doing it. That's how many there are. Okay? That's homework. Do this for homework, go back, put it down, try to find out how many there are. So, when it says this, how did they know this 2,500 years ago unless God inspired Jeremiah to write it correctly? Now, they just opened the Keck telescope in Hawaii on Mauna Kea, on the mountaintop there on the Big Island, about 1.5 years ago. They were able to look further into space than they'd ever seen. And still, space was covered with endless stars. So this perspective could not have been achieved by Jeremiah, because if he looked out at the night sky, he would have been able to count them. And he would have known they weren't as the stars. So this is very firm and convincing proof. And God uses this to confirm his captivity. Now I want to show this relationship to evolution, because I think everyone's seen something like this. And I think we've seen this before, and I've used this before. But this is kind of the classical picture that evolutionists give. First, a small ape-like creature stands on 2 feet, and then they get bigger, and the brain cavity gets bigger, and then they need a shave, and then maybe they get to find a few smaller ones, they get a little bit bigger, and finally they end up looking something like us. Okay, and this is the standard picture. And if you go to the American Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C., the Smithsonian, you see a horse, similar thing. You'll see a little, small horse, and then the horse gets bigger, and then it might get a little smaller, and finally it ends up being an Arabian horse, and so on. And in New York, they had a similar exhibit on the horse at the Museum of Natural History in Central Park. But a number of scientists, myself included, protested to them some years back that this was a phony exhibit. And in fact, it was. Because the fossils that made up the sequence were not datable chronologically. And so you could find a bunch of different forms of different sides and brain cavity and say, oh, they must have progressively get bigger. But just think about it a minute. You could do the same thing for the dog. I could take a Chihuahua and say, okay, here's a Chihuahua, and then a Cocker Spaniel, and this one, and I get a St. Bernard. Look, see how dogs are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it boils down to that some of the scientific evidence, I'm not saying all, but some of the scientific evidence which has been cited over and over again are at that level of fudging it. The British Museum in England has actually had a scandal recently because they found out that bones dated earlier had been moved around so that they fit into the sequence that met their preconceived notion. So this kind of picture, which you see all the time, please don't accept this as proof. This is a model. This is the way they would like it to be. As far as a continuous proof of this, all dated accurately, there is not a single sequence anywhere in the world that matches this. And you will not see it. And I'll show you more on this in a few minutes. The other thing that's quite interesting is that Homo sapiens, which is what we are, seem to appear quite suddenly. And they date it to 40,000 years ago, but I'm not going to push dates. But it appears quite suddenly and don't seem to have any direct relationship to previous species. And that's kind of mysterious. In fact, one biologist wrote a book recently called The Mystery of Modern Man, because they have not been able to link us directly to previous species. And so I think that's kind of something to be a little bit careful about, the way this is done, and just assume just because you see a model like this in a book, this is a standard reference book, or you see it in an encyclopedia or even in a museum, that constitutes proof. It doesn't. Second thing is that dating anything beyond a few tens of thousands of years by any physical method is almost impossible. The way these things are dated are from the layer they're found in. In a couple of cases, I have tried to, one of the things I do is I'm a diffractionist. I do X-ray work. And I tried to get a museum to give me a sample of one of these fossils to do X-ray fluorescence. Now, the one thing I can do with that is I can find how much radioactive element there is and how much potassium isotope they are, and you can get some estimate of how long it might have been existing. They wouldn't give me a sample. I couldn't prove that it was 4 million years old, but I certainly could prove it was older than 40, 50,000 years old. And the reason they wouldn't give me a sample, I should mention, this is the ones that were found in East Africa from the Leakeys. They will not give any of these out for radioactive analysis or other kinds of analysis, because I think they have a copyright on it. And they write books about this and they make money. All right, fine. But don't go around making extreme claims either, if you're not willing to openly let other scientists look at what you're doing. I couldn't get away with that on my job. But this is the level. Imagine Newton saying, okay, I got the laws of physics, here's what they are, but I don't want anyone else to run a test on them. Please don't send a rocket up or flip a coin. Can you imagine some other scientist trying to do science that way? I can't. The same objective standards of evidence are not always held when it comes to biology, and I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because they don't have any other way of doing it. But my most fun at dealing with biology is to read what biologists are writing. Anyone here ever hear of Stephen Jay Gould? Okay. Stephen Jay Gould is professor of evolutionary biology at Harvard University. And as we like to say in Michigan, Harvard is the Michigan of the East. Okay? In fact, you can buy a T-shirt in our bookstore that says that. Harvard, the Michigan of the East. Actually, I think Michigan's a better university. We could beat them. And that's one school I know we can beat in football. Anyway, Gould is very well known. He's written a lot of books, and he's probably the leading current generation biologist. Now, when Darwin wrote his Origin of Species, there were only a limited number of fossils around. And at that time, no one had ever proved that one species came from another. You know the classical one where the fish is in the sea, and then finally the fish gets something that looks like little legs, and then the fish walks on land, and then he gets big. That's sort of the standard kind of, it's so standard that cartoonists often use it as a joke. All right? You know, there is no such fossil ever been found of what I call an intermediate between two species. Now, that's not to say evolution doesn't occur on a short term. In fact, maybe the word evolution shouldn't be used there. Maybe the word adaptability can be used. For example, it's been shown that among butterflies and among moths, that certain colorings favor survival. And a famous one is where a white moth was attracted to an industrial town in England in the 19th century, and as that town used more and more coal and got grayer and sootier, the white moths were easy prey, and the darker, grayer species of moth would survive being eaten by birds and other things that were their enemies. And so by and by, white moths started fading away, and you ended up with mostly the dark moths. But that's not evolution. That's adaptability. Evolution would be if the moth becomes a pussycat. That's evolution. That's an origin of species. Okay? Now, this has never been proved. In the Darwinian sense, Darwin's own answer to this was, we got to keep looking. We don't have enough fossils. Well, 150 years later, there are tens of thousands more fossils, and yet no one has ever found an intermediary between two different species. part fish, part man, part mammal, part amphibian, whatever. Never, ever been found. Interesting. I want you to look at a verse in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 15. And I don't think you will ever find one. And they are, believe me, they are looking and looking and looking and looking and looking. But 1 Corinthians 15, and I'd like you to look at this verse. Verse 38. And for connection, 39 is the verse I want to focus on. But God giveth to the body as it pleased him, and to every seed his own body. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. And he shows clearly the different types of species and says they're separate, they're different. The evolutionary biologist says we've all come from one. It's just not true. If it is true, the evidence is totally lacking. And I think we ought to bear that in mind, and I think that's an important point. The evidence for intermediate species between two different branches just does not exist. Evolution within a species we see all the time. Okay? The adaptability of the moth is clear. That happens. And survival of the fittest within a species group, that happens. But that's not the same as creation. And I don't think, very dangerous thing I always tell my students, if you've got several data points, don't extrapolate your data beyond where you've actually got information. What biologists do is they have a data point here, they have a data point here, and they extrapolate it back 5 billion years. That's not kosher, as we say. Okay? I mean, if you have data here and here, you're only entitled to know what happened between them, unless you have some very, very powerful other evidence. Now, I want to show you something. I mentioned Stephen Jay Gould. What is the mechanism for creation? If it is not God, and it is not the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection, okay, what is the mechanism? Well, Gould, in looking at thousands of fossils, has come to the conclusion that slow evolution has never been evidenced. And I'm going to read you from his own book. This is Book of Life, edited by Stephen Gould, and you can buy this. It's a relatively recent book, 1995. He's talking about the explosion of fossils in the Cambrian period. And let's not worry about what the Cambrian period is, but let's read what he cites as how this all came about. The Cambrian has always been a mystery, a highway starting in a desert. In other words, before the Cambrian, there seemed to be no life forms at all, and then all of a sudden they explode. Now we have pathways converging to feed it, and it turns out to be a broader road than we knew. Yet it is no gradual story. Get that? No gradual story. That discovery is revealed, but a revolutionary episode crammed with new animals, some big, some small, some with skeletons, some without. Can we account for the sudden appearance of so many fundamentally different kinds of animals, the basic phyla? And why did the variety of animals within each phyla rocket so steeply upward? Scientists would like to know. And then he cites the model that is being proposed. What happens when animals flood into empty ecological space is a sequence well known in life's history. Not only individuals, but all species begin to climb at a geometric rate. 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. Girat Vermigi puts it, new species are basically accidents that happen as populations of individuals adapt to local environment. This is the new model, okay? Darwin was gradual change. He says there is no gradual change. The new model is accidents. So all life got here by accident. And all new species come by accident. Now, if that's a model, if I were working in a profession that put that forward as a model, I'd change my profession. I'll tell you the truth. I mean, I couldn't imagine doing that with anything in physics or engineering. I mean, if any of you are working engineers or physicists, can you imagine going into your boss and say, well, I can explain it all. It's an accident. I mean, you wouldn't last long. Why is that? This is the leading evolutionary biologist. Imagine what the lesser people are saying. Now, when I point this out to my colleagues, you know what reaction I get among the physicists? They go, those guys are terrible scientists anyway. What do you expect? When I talk to the biologists, they go, well, we don't have any other model. This is on this book. It's 1993, the edition I have. It's pages 56 and 57. It's in the library. Okay? So somebody tells you that they got a model for evolution, say the model is accident. It's not Darwin. It's not original. This is what they're selling. Let me show you some other things. This is by another biologist who in this book, it's called The Great Evolution Mystery. He's got a whole list of things that are problems. Why evolution doesn't seem to work. And he's got this whole list of different problems. And here it is, the suddenness with which major changes in pattern occurred and virtual absence of any fossil remains from the period in which they were alleged to be evolving. And let me explain what that means. Suppose that you need an eye to see. And you have to develop this organism, this eye, in order to focus. Now, can you imagine taking 50 million years to develop the eye? That was actually brought up by Darwin. And the way he brought it up, he said, if very complex organs, if we can't really explain this is a problem with my theory. Now, people forgot about that. And people like Richard Dawkins and others have written about it, and they've looked at this species and said, oh, here's a half-formed eye in this one, here's part one in this one, and we can show that there's all different stages of eye development. That doesn't prove evolution. That only proves, from my mind, that proves the designer had different designs in mind. Now, when this biologist looked at this, he says, what happens? The very first time we find a species that has to see with an eye, it's got a completely formed eyeball. In fact, even more remarkable, no one has ever found a species with one eye. Okay, think about that. If you evolve and it's kind of random and it's all accident, suppose it's his model, why don't we have somebody with one eyeball in the middle, except on science fiction TV? The very first mammals that are developed, the very first fish, the very first things that have eyes at all, have not only good eyes, different levels of sophistication, obviously, but they all see, and they see in 3 dimensions. And if that were not true, no one would ever be able to catch their prey, right? No one in Southern California wouldn't be able to drive. I mean, that's really serious, right? Now, what accounts for that? How can you account for that by accident, that the minute the eye is there, it works, it functions, it sees in 3 dimensions? It has a lens, and it can focus that lens, and it can see over a wide range of optical differences. Now, did that all happen overnight? According to Darwin, it should have taken millions of years to occur. But what did you do in between when you couldn't see? Or you couldn't see perfectly? How would you have survived? And pretty soon you come to the realization that this is something that really ought to bother biologists, not just this one guy who wrote this book. Because even going back to Darwin, he pointed out that complexity was a problem. Well, it's a big problem. Because a half-formed eyeball is useless. And there is no such evidence of half-formed eyeballs. Okay? Let's take a look at another thing. Suddenness of new forms radiating into numerous variants. And that's the other thing. Once an accident occurs, it seems to explode. You get all kinds of different variations in it right away, and they all seem to adapt. Now, I think that's very important, because if this were not true, if you had this suddenness were not true, you would find that something evolved, and then it couldn't survive, and it would just decay and would never flourish. But it seems once something new is evidenced, it immediately seems to survive and grow. And that's kind of remarkable. Suddenness of extinctions. Well, we don't have to dwell on all of these in detail, but when things disappear, they completely disappear. They don't seem to phase out over millions of years either. And that's always been a troubling thing. Repeated occurrences of changes calling for numerous coordinated innovations. That's probably what I said about the eye, but it's about a lot of other things. Can you imagine evolving a heart that only beats once in a while? Or lung power that isn't sufficient to take care of the air capacity? Or any other organ that you need, the liver or the kidney to filter with your kidneys. What if they didn't work perfectly? I mean, this idea of a coordinated innovation, do you know how many different changes you need to make the eye function? It's about 10 billion different changes. You need to have the lens system work perfectly. You need to have the recording system with all those little ends that sense the light. You need color coordination. You need to store the images. Think of how wonderful the brain is. The eye not only takes in the data, it keeps sending pictures to your brain. Many of us can remember an image we saw years ago, right? So that information is all there, and it had to be there. You think about an animal who has to see that information. He's got to now recognize his enemy. He's got to recognize his prey. All those images need the storage capacity. So the eye cannot work independent of a lot of changes in the brain in order to handle all that information and store it and use it. And all of that had to evolve like that. Because if the animal doesn't store the information about its enemy, it doesn't use its eye very long. It gets eaten. It becomes dinner. So all of those things have to occur at the same time. Or let's take another case. Coordinated innovation goes further than that. It's coordination between two very separate things. Okay? We all know, I'll give you a couple examples, a simple example. You all know about the birds and the bees, right? Do you all know that trees and plant things have boy and girl? Did you know that? Now, I won't ask you what's the difference, because I really am afraid the answer I might get. But I tell you, many years ago, I had a holly bush. And that's the thing, with the little red berries on it. And when I bought this house, there were 2 holly bushes, and they weren't doing well. So I called my father-in-law, who was an expert in horticulture, and I said to him, my holly bushes look terrible. And he says to me, well, the trouble is there's no boy holly bushes around, and they're rather depressed and sad. And I thought, he's pulling my leg. A girl holly bush and a boy holly bush, how do you tell the difference? So he came over the house, and he brought a horticulture book, and there is a difference. I'm not going to tell you what the difference is, you have to lift up the leaf to look. But the boy holly bush doesn't have berries, okay? The girl one does. So he planted a couple of boy holly bushes, and within 5 to 6 weeks, the other ones they weren't being cross-pollinated. And so the bush was really not getting all its energies up, and it wasn't functioning correctly. How did this happen? Can you imagine someone saying, let's evolve a girl holly bush, and okay, a million years later we'll have the boy holly bush. Those all had to happen at the same time. But let's go a little further. You have flowers. You have all these flowers, and you have all this sense of this around you. How many of you realize that flowers in many, many species, many trees, are pollinated by bees, right? So the bees have to go, and they have to take the nectar. That's why I asked if you know about the birds and the bees. And then they have to go to other ones, and they bring the pollen around with them, right? What happened before there were bees? We wait 50 million years for the bees to come along? Of course not. Both of those things have to occur at the same time. They have to be coordinated, and that's what he's talking about. There are literally, in this book, if you get a chance to read it, The Great Evolution Mystery, there are literally thousands upon thousands of things in nature that if they were not coordinated, they couldn't occur. And so it's not just one thing by accident. You need lots and lots of accidents, and they all have to occur at the same time. To me, that means somebody had to be planning it. To a biologist, the answer is, we don't know, it's an accident. Okay? I don't have enough faith to believe in accidents. I like the Bible explanation a lot better. Okay? Let's see what else we have here. No new phyla have appeared and no new classes or orders. That's just what I read you from 1 Corinthians 15. Everything that's been found in nature, the various phyla, fishes are still fishes, men are still men, trees are still, fowls are still fowls. They all remain the same. There's a lot of hand waving, right? Birds are supposed to come from dinosaurs. Okay, and then 2 weeks later I read an article that maybe that's not true. Maybe dinosaurs came from birds. Okay, I'm serious. Those both appeared about the same time. Okay? Convergent and parallel, existence of long-term. We can go on before. Appearance of organs before they are needed. Okay? All of these, the overshoot. Oh yeah, this is interesting because, I showed you that model about how things get bigger and bigger and brain capacity gets bigger. But that's not necessarily true. And the woolly mammoth is a classic example. The woolly mammoths have much bigger brains, appear to have been much larger in size and stronger than present-day elephants. But they're gone, and the weaker ones have survived. That's not easy to understand. That's not so much from creation, but the underpinning of the model of natural selection. Natural selection doesn't always work. Sometimes a weaker species survives. Okay? By the way they choose to adapt themselves. This is another sort of classical one. A puzzle of how organs once evolved come to be lost or be degenerate. Biologists have long argued about what's the use of the appendix. I brought this up to someone and he said, well, without that, a lot of doctors wouldn't be earning all this money from appendicitis. And so, but that might be a joke, but in fact, there's no one's ever figured out the reason for this. Let me see. How many more we got? Oh, yes. This is, again, the failure of some organisms to evolve at all. The people at Johns Hopkins, Stanley, who's a similar type person from Gould, they've been working on and off for the last 20, 25 years on this. He has shown that some organisms never seem to evolve. For example, a clam. Today, the fossil would look identical to a clam that you might find in a level 500 million years old. No change whatsoever. In fact, many, many shellfish have never, ever evolved or changed at all. And that's kind of strange. Why do some get triggered and some don't? What is the mechanism that some species evolve and others never change? The answer from biologists is we don't know. And so you have this kind of thing. The normal kind of thinking about evolution is everything gets bigger, better, smarter. But in fact, in the real evidence in fossils and in nature that is almost never true. There is not a direct link. If you want to read this book, it's by Taylor, and it's called The Great Evolution Mystery. Okay? And I've found that one of the best ways to really get an insight into what the thinking is among biologists and evolutionists is to actually read their own writings. Because the idea that everything is all figured out and they have all the answers, this is not at all true. It just does not appear in the literature that way. I told you about this sort of standard thing about the fish getting legs and then walking out of the sea. There was this cartoon some years back in that now defunct British publication Punch. But there's two spacemen, and they're standing on a beach and they're watching two scuba divers coming out, and they say, wait, we may just have landed at a significant moment in this planet's evolution. So the idea, this is sort of the common fiction that man evolved from the sea. But the real fact of the matter is that it is worth poking fun at because there is not one single piece of evidence to prove it. Okay? I'll stop at this point, and I promise to leave some time for questions and on the topic and the nature of the universe, just small questions. Okay? And I'll be glad to answer them. And if I don't get questions, I usually give a quiz. So help me out. Yeah, Ben. Oh, I think the Earth is very old. I don't know exactly, but it's pretty old. If you look at Genesis 1, and I think it's dangerous to get into dating things that we don't have totally firm evidence, but the earth is very, very old. He says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And so God did, that was the first thing he did. Then he said, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So when God set up to create the present order of things, he was already building on what he had earlier created. And whatever was here before, it probably messed up. And he started all over again. But I think the earth has been used for other purposes in the past. I think the evidence of it is pretty obvious. We're not the only thing God has ever created. And I think it would be pretty egocentric of us to think we were. Yeah. The Big Bang Theory? What's the latest Big Bang Theory?
The Big Bang in the universe and the earth was created.
Well, you notice you just said the Big Bang Theory. Yeah, there were about 20 different Big Bang theories, and it doesn't have too much to do with evolution. Yeah, the interesting thing about the Big Bang Theory is whatever model you take, it's an admission by scientists that there must have at one time or other been a creation. Until this century, actually until about 40 years ago, most scientists believed the universe was forever, that it always existed. And they didn't believe there was ever a creation. So the Big Bang, and whatever model you put, is an admission by scientists that there was a time when the universe had to be created. As far as the specific Big Bang Theory, I wouldn't even begin to argue about a theory, because I don't think any of them are solvable right now. Yep.
Mention the theory of without evolution. The theory.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, the way the scriptures present it? Oh, I don't think that science has a good model for creation. I mean, if you go by what Gould was saying, he takes it to be an accident.
My point is that you ask someone reading Darwin why their theory is not law.
Yeah.
And so, well, this was freedom. He's talking to find out more.
Mm-hmm.
You ask someone why their creation is not a law, and say, well, you say. I don't think different things.
Okay, that's a fair point. As someone who believes in Darwin says we need more and more evidence. Okay, they've had 150 years to look for this evidence, and in fact, the evidence has contradicted the original model. Okay, this is exactly what Gould says. So we do not see gradual changes. Period. We don't see it. So Darwin's original model, in fact, is almost universally accepted as being wrong today. All right, and so what has come about is that people like Gould and others are now being called neo-Darwinists or new Darwinists, because they don't want to admit that there was any design or creation. So they have this new model of accidents. So I would say that the first point is that the Darwinism as a theory has already been proven wrong, just to correct what you said. The theory of gradual change, evolving better and better, has been proven wrong by the very evidence. Okay. Second point, that doesn't prove the creation. And you're absolutely right. At some point, you have to accept faith. The difference, I would say, in the way I would believe faith is that the Scripture says that faith is the substance of things hoped for. So the Bible has confirmed its word in other ways, through prophecy, through history, through its moral presence, through other things that we can say make sense and are good, and in themselves give me confidence that that's the Word of God. So if I have a model of something and I find that this fits, that fits, that fits, and I look at prophecy and I look at the moral teachings and I look at what Jesus Christ has presented and everything, then I feel much more comfortable. And when I said earlier, I said I don't have enough faith to believe in Darwin, but I do have enough faith to believe in what the Scriptures is teaching. And that's the way I would look at it. At some point, when we have not actually been there and witnessed it, faith does take over. But faith doesn't have to be blind. And I think that's the difference. So I think the evidence that the Bible presents comes at many different levels, and to me is logical. But for me to say to you, well, I was there and I saw the creation, well, obviously I can't do that. At some point we have to have that faith. Now, that's important because none of us have ever seen the resurrection either. So we have to, at some point, have faith in God that the two things He did do, create and give eternal life, are going to actually happen. It's got to be based on everything else that's in between in the Scriptures and see if that model makes us comfortable. Fair enough? Okay. Yeah, Lisa? I think what I would like to see taught in the classroom, and what I finally convinced my son's high school to do, was to give me an hour to talk to the class. They never did that again for Peter, and I'm sure in Sunny Hills they wouldn't let me near the building. I think they ought to at least let young people know that it is a theory, that there are other competing ideas, and that creation by design and by a God, and I don't think you have to shove anything down their throat specifically, is also something that ought to be considered. I'd be happy enough if they do that. I don't think they have to teach. I certainly don't want them teaching creation science and young earth and all that, because I don't think that's right either. But I think they ought to at least be honest to young people and say, this is a model. The model has a lot of experimental problems. There's a lot of evidence lacking. Scientists themselves are not fully convinced of it. And there is another alternative taught through faith by most major religions, not just Christians, by the way. The Koran and others teach also God's creation. And they ought to at least spend 20 minutes telling children, that there is more than one way to look at this. I'd be happy if they do that. I've been arguing. I'll tell you something else that happened. Any of you get Scientific American? Okay. Then I'll talk to, I won't bring it up. Well, if you haven't read the article, there's no point. I may publish something on this in commercial in the tidings in the next couple of months. Okay? Yep.
So what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I read something about that too, but that was a speculation. Frankly, it wouldn't surprise me if there was life elsewhere in the universe. I would think that God is a God of creation. And if He's going to fill the earth with His glory, fill the universe with His glory. So I just don't know about it, and I don't know what He's done. And the main problem of finding and proving life within our own solar system is that anything we send out there, might contaminate it, and all we'll bring back is something we put there ourselves. But I personally think that God has no other intelligent life in this in this solar, this whole solar system. We're quarantined. I mean, would you let anyone else near us? I mean, you got to realize that the Earth and our solar system is like on the fringe of the galaxy. We're not in the densely populated star part of the galaxy. I mean, if this is the galactic center over here, somewhere like over, if I can get this thing to work, this is the galactic center, we're way out here at the fringe. And we're a long way from the galactic center, and we're in a very, very sparsely populated part of the universe. I don't think it's entirely an accident. I mean, I wouldn't let anyone near this race. Yep. Sure. I'm not a geologist, though. I may not be able to answer it. Uh-huh. Oh, that one I can't answer for you. They did a chemical analysis on it, and it was very similar to some stuff that was sent back from data recording from the probe that they landed on Mars, the Viking probe. So there was a great deal of similarity, and they think that maybe a meteorite, a very large one, hit Mars, knocked something in the orbit, and we got some of that debris. But I think to be careful, they did say, if I remember the article I read, that there was a high probability. I don't think they could identify. Well, if it was in the LA Times, then what can I say? Was it in the New York Times too? I'm getting the signal I think I'm going to be pulled off.
Any last question?
Anyway, thanks a lot. It's been a pleasure to visit, and if anyone wants to stick around until they throw me out, I'll be glad to talk to you more. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening to the Good Christadelphian Talks podcast. We hope this talk helped you in your walk and brightened your day. If you would like to hear more, please subscribe for new episodes. We are on all major podcast platforms and also on YouTube. If you enjoyed this particular talk, please share it with someone else who you think might enjoy it too. For show notes on the talk you just listened to, visit our website at GoodChristadelphianTalks.com or check out the show notes section of your podcast player. Please share your thoughts on the talk from this week on our Facebook or Instagram pages where we are at Good Christadelphian Talks, or leave a comment on our YouTube channel where these talks are posted as well. If you enjoy listening to the talks that we post and hear one that you think we should share, please tell us about it. You can send us a suggestion using the Contact Us tab on our website or message us on any of our social media accounts. Thank you for listening. God bless, and talk to you next week.